If there's one thing every woodworker needs, it's a work table. And this was ours. It tried its best, but a good work table means you don't have to hold down pieces with one hand while sanding with the other, wrestle with awkward devices just to cut a mortise, or fasten clamps every time you plane an edge. So yeah, it needed an upgrade. And that's exactly what we're doing today. Fair warning, this will not be heirloom quality. It will not be made from recycled pallets or exotic hardwood. It will probably not outlive us. It won't even have a single dovetail. It's just a simple and practical upgrade that we needed, though we may have overcomplicated it just a bit. To be fair, this was our first work table, a repurposed sideboard, so our old one was actually already a big step up. When we made it, we used some 4x8s and OSB left over from building our shop, so the base was rock solid and there was no need to change it. But the top was too narrow, and it had this stylish gouge from a router bit that tried to escape at one point, so it was time for an upgrade. We had apparently gone a little overboard with the screws when building the old version, but we finally got them all out, lifted the old top off and carried it over to our wood storage. While we were there, we found a nice sheet of plywood and hauled it back. Technically, it was way too nice for shop furniture, but since it was left over from another project, the price was exactly zero, and we all know that's the best price. With the plywood in place, it was time to trim it to size. We dug out the track saw and measured both sides, just to make sure everything was straight. Then we placed the track, remembered to hook up the dust collection, and made the cut. Now the blade in our track saw loves to flex sideways, so even though the plywood wasn't that thick, we took 2 passes, just to make sure it stayed straight. The result was pretty good. A tiny bit of burning, but nothing a quick sanding wouldn't fix. To get the width right, we used this rail, did some quick math, and marked where to cut. You might already have an idea of what we have planned, but if not, don't worry, it will be back later in the video. We set the fence, locked it in, and got to cutting. Cutting a full sheet of plywood on a small table saw isn't exactly ideal. A sliding table saw would have been much more comfortable, but the one at our co-working space was a long walk from our area, and hauling a heavy sheet of plywood all the way there was way too much effort for just one cut. Besides, there were 2 of us, so we made it work. And with that, we had a properly sized tabletop ready to be fixed in place. A few screws later, the work table had a new top. What we figured out not too long afterwards was that we should have marked the screw's location. But at this point, we were still happy and excited to keep moving. Now, here's what makes this table better than the last one. Holes. A lot of holes. And when you're drilling a lot of holes, there is nothing better than a good template. So we made one. We even remembered to reattach the dust collector to the miter saw, unlike last time. This template spanned the full width of the work table, which was great, but we needed to make sure the holes in the template itself were consistent. So naturally we made a smaller template for the big template. We carefully marked where each hole should go, unpacked a brand new 20mm Forstner bit, and got to work. This would have been the perfect time to double check the spacing, but let's just move on. We transfer the holes from the small template to the big one. Then we unpacked our newly acquired bench dog set and used it to transfer the holes to the actual tabletop, 1 row at a time. Now I'll spare you the joy of watching us drill 188 holes in a tabletop. It mostly went according to plan, although forgetting to mark the screw locations means we hit a few of them along the way and pretty much destroyed the Forstner bit. Lesson learned if we ever need to perforate another tabletop. Also, a few rows in is when we realized we should have measured the spacing earlier, since the rows started to drift. It wasn't off by much, just a few millimeters, but it compounds quickly. Luckily we caught it in time and could adjust, so it wasn't a huge deal, just really annoying. So this was what we had in mind, and here's the result so far. Not bad at all. At this point, we thought the tedious part was over. We were wrong. The edges were a bit sharp and the bench dogs didn't fit quite right, so we grabbed the palm router and chamfered all 188 holes, both top and bottom. And then we had a functional table. But we weren't done just yet. Remember that rail from earlier? When designing this table, we wanted it to be multifunctional. One thing we do fairly often is flatten panels and slabs that don't fit in our planer, as well as make precise grooves and cuts. But making a new jig every time is a hassle, and we don't have the space for a separate fixed setup. So we figured we'd integrate it into our work table. But before we get to that, if you have enjoyed the video so far, maybe send it to a friend who'd like it too. It would mean a lot to us. Alright, back to the build. We picked up some pretty beefy SBR20 rails, two 1500mm ones and two 1000mm ones. The goal was to make a rudimentary CNC-like contraption that can be easily attached and removed. So we ripped some plywood to width and lined everything up to maximize the usable area of the jig. Next up was attaching the rails to the plywood strips. Now here's the challenge. The rails are precision engineered in a factory. We, on the other hand, are woodworkers with, let's call it artisan precision. Any inaccuracies here would mean that the rails would pinch and not slide well. First thing that came to mind was painter's tape. So we put some on the bearing blocks and marked the holes with a pencil. Then we peeled it off and shredded it in the process. Back to the drawer for take 2, this time with toughened duct tape. That worked a lot better. We transferred the whole position over to the plywood with a hole punch and clamped both plywood strips together to drill all the holes at once. Then we secured the plywood to the rails and mounted the shorter rails to the bearing blocks. With X and Y axis functional, we moved on to the router carriage. The idea was to have the router under the rails and to raise and lower the bit depending on the workpiece. We misaligned these holes ever so slightly, which was a major headache since it pinched the rails, making it harder to slide the carriage. It was late in the day and our brains were fried from too much measuring and calculating, so it took us a few tries, but we eventually got it right and could glue and screw on the vertical pieces under the horizontal ones. The last step was the router platform. We cut a thin piece of plywood to width, traced the holes from the router base to the plywood, then used the jigsaw to cut an opening for the router bit. To avoid screws poking out, we used a thick drill bit to countersink them. And finally, we could assemble everything. With the router mounted, it slid onto the rails and we were one step closer to the finish line. The tabletop already looked pretty good, but we wanted it to stay that way, so we grabbed a can of hard wax oil and started treating it. Once that was done, it was time to test everything. It worked really well, at least for thicker pieces, but it couldn't reach low enough for thinner ones. So the next day we built version 2.0. We followed the same process, but instead of the plywood platform we used some rods that came with a palm router. This had two benefits. First, it made it easier to see the workpiece, which is handy. And second, it was just much easier to build, which we liked. Apart from that, the process was the same, and the only change was making the vertical pieces taller so the router could reach thinner workpieces. And just like that, we had two jigs, one for precision cuts in thinner workpieces and one for flattening thicker slabs. Time to try out the new jig too. The first attempt was to freehand a straight cut. That went as well as you'd expect. I probably went too deep with the bit, so it jumped all over the place. But I did learn two things. First, freehanding is a bad idea when trying to make straight cuts. Second, if ever we want to make fake bug holes, this works great. So for accuracy, we got some end stops and tightened them onto the rails, so the router was locked to a controlled work area. That worked perfectly. By the way, if you wonder what this piece is supposed to be, make sure to subscribe as that will be our next video. So with the build complete, here are our thoughts. We no longer have to hold down smaller pieces while we sand them, which was a major annoyance with the last table. And having an integrated router sled for flattening slabs and making precision cuts is amazing, and it saves a lot of space. Swapping between the configurations is super easy, it's just 4 screws and done. The router carriage can definitely be improved, and we are already thinking about how to make the height adjustable and maybe even swap in different tools like a planer or a belt sander, or even to convert it into a full CNC. So in summary, the new work table might not be particularly flashy, and it took a lot more effort than expected, but it's easily one of the best upgrades we've made to the shop. We'll probably tweak it more in the future, but for now, we are super happy with it. If you got any ideas or suggestions, drop them in the comments. We would really love to hear them. Thank you for watching.